Lagos is a city of dreams, where the rich get richer and the poor are left to fight for scraps. In the heart of this fast-moving world, three young men, Kelvin, John, and Steve, found themselves trapped in the cycle of poverty. They had grown up together in the same neighborhood, bonded by struggle and the dream of escaping hardship. Kelvin was the bold one, always chasing money by any means necessary. John was his loyal follower, eager for wealth and status. Steve, however, was different, cautious and thoughtful, though still desperate for change. They had tried everything, hustling on the streets, gambling, running small businesses, but nothing seemed to work. One evening, as they sat in a rundown beer parlor, sipping cheap drinks, Kelvin spoke with a sinister glint in his eyes. "I know someone who can help us," he said, lowering his voice. John leaned in. "Who?" Kelvin smirked. "A ritualist. A real one. No scams. No fake promises. He can give us money, real money." Steve shivered. "And what does he want in return?" Kelvin hesitated before saying, "The blood of our mothers." The table fell silent. The weight of his words sank deep. John exhaled sharply. "Our mothers." Kelvin nodded. "Wealth comes at a price." Steve pushed back his chair. "I can't do that. My mother. She suffered to raise me. What kind of monster would I be?" Kelvin leaned in. "And what kind of fool will you be if you let this opportunity slip?" That night, they left the bar with troubled hearts. Steve couldn't sleep, tormented by thoughts of his mother's love and sacrifices. Meanwhile, Kelvin and John wrestled with their own guilt, but greed was louder than conscience. Days later, Kelvin and John went to meet the ritualist. The journey took them deep into a secluded part of the city, to an abandoned building with strange markings on the walls. An old man, his eyes black as night, sat in the middle of the room. "You have come," he rasped. "You seek wealth." Kelvin nodded. "Yes." The old man smiled, revealing yellowed teeth. "Then you know the price. Blood for wealth." John swallowed hard. "How do we do it?" The ritualist handed them a small, black calabash. "Slit their throats. Let the blood fill this calabash. Bring it to me before the moon sets. Fail, and you will face madness worse than death." Kelvin and John left the shrine, their hands shaking. But greed had taken root in their hearts. They had made their choice. Kelvin's mother, a widow, was a kind woman who had struggled to raise her son alone. She lived in a modest apartment, believing in hard work and prayer. That evening, Kelvin visited her with a fake smile. "Mama, I brought you food," he said, handing her a plate. She beamed. "My son. May God bless you." As she turned to get water, Kelvin pulled out a sharp knife, his hand trembling. For a moment, he hesitated. But then he remembered the mansions, the cars, the life he had always dreamed of. With a deep breath, he wrapped his arm around her neck and dragged the blade across her throat. Blood sprayed across the room as she gasped, her eyes wide with shock and betrayal. She tried to speak, but the words never came. Her body slumped to the floor, lifeless. Kelvin quickly filled the calabash with her blood, breathing heavily. His hands were shaking, his heart pounding, but there was no turning back now. Meanwhile, John had lured his mother into a dark alley, claiming his car had broken down. "John, why did you bring me here?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. He pretended to fix his shoe, then suddenly turned and plunged a dagger into her stomach. My son," she gasped, clutching at him. John pressed his hand over her mouth, pushing the knife deeper until she stopped struggling. Tears streamed down his face as he watched the life drain from her eyes. He had done the unthinkable. With shaking hands, he gathered her blood into the calabash and hurried to meet Kelvin. That night, they returned to the ritualist, the calabashes heavy in their hands. The old man took the blood and poured it over a black cloth, chanting words in a language they did not understand. The ground trembled, the air grew thick, and suddenly, gold coins rained from the ceiling. Kelvin and John gasped. It was real. They were rich. The consequences. Overnight, they became Lagos' newest millionaires. Expensive cars, designer clothes, lavish mansions, their lives transformed instantly. Steve, who had refused to commit the act, was not so lucky. Within days, madness took hold of him. He was seen roaming the streets, talking to himself, his clothes tattered, his mind lost. The curse had found him. Kelvin and John, however, were given one strict rule: never eat normal food again. Human flesh was their only sustenance. At first, they obeyed. Their meals were secretly prepared, their dark hunger satisfied in private. But wealth breeds recklessness. One night, they went to a luxury restaurant with some beautiful women. Drinks flowed, laughter filled the air, and for the first time in a long time, they forgot about the rules. They ordered plates of jollof rice, pepper soup, and grilled chicken. The first bite was heavenly. The second bite was fatal. As soon as they swallowed, their bodies convulsed. Pain ripped through their insides like fire. Their veins turned black, their skin shriveled, and their once handsome faces twisted into horrifying masks of decay. The women screamed as the two men fell to the floor, foaming at the mouth. Within minutes, their bodies decomposed into rotting flesh, their wealth disappearing as if it had never existed. By morning, their corpses were unrecognizable, the stench of death clinging to the air. Steve, the madman, continued to wander the streets, his fate worse than death. His mind, shattered. His soul, cursed. Kelvin and Jade, once envied by many, became nothing but cautionary tales whispered in the dark. And their mothers. Their bodies were never found. The ritualist had taken them, fuel for the next desperate souls who would come knocking, begging for wealth. But Lagos remained unchanged. The rich still flaunted their wealth, the poor still struggled, and in the shadows, the cycle continued, waiting for the next victims of greed.